Hey night travelers, tonight we're skipping the philosopher's stone fairy tales and diving straight into the smoky, explosive, and occasionally poisonous life of a medieval alchemist. Forget glittering gold, secret elixirs, and mystical wisdom. You're about to spend the day hunched over bubbling cauldrons, inhaling dangerous fumes, and explaining to angry patrons why you haven't turned anything into gold yet. Congratulations, you've just woken up in the year 1462. The good news, you have your own workshop and people think you might be a genius. The bad news, most of them also think you might be a fraud. The first thing you notice is the smell, a pungent mix of burning charcoal, sour vinegar, and something you spilled on the floor last night that's still smoking. Your lab is a cluttered, dimly lit room stuffed with glass alembics, copper crucibles, and piles of strange powders. Some of them are rare minerals worth a fortune. Others will kill you if you so much as breathe too close. You sleep in the corner, under shelves stacked with ingredients you can't identify in daylight. The good news, you get to experiment with exotic substances from all over the known world. The bad news, the experiments often end in loud bangs, shattered glass, and a lingering cough. You spend half your day grinding metals into dust, stirring noxious concoctions, and muttering over cryptic manuscripts written by people who probably also died of mercury poisoning. Outside your workshop, the street bustles with merchants and apprentices running errands. Inside, you're juggling a noble's impatient demand for the elixir of life, a monk's request for invisible ink, and your own desperate hope to finally unlock the great work. Spoiler: you won't. By the time you've burned your fingers on a hot crucible, stained your robe with something corrosive, and convinced yourself today might be the day you discover immortality, you're just trying not to blow yourself up before supper. You wake with a metallic taste at the back of your throat, as if you had chewed on a nail in your sleep. The palette of the room is a chord of smells: bitter smoke, old vinegar gone sour, the sweet coppery tang of boiled metals, and the sharp, choking sting of sulfur that has wormed into the fabric of your tunic. Light slices in through a slit window, a thin bar of gray morning that picks out floating motes, dust, soot, and whatever finer poisons you stirred up yesterday. For a moment you lie very still and let it all press in. The heat on the tiles from last night's furnace, the faint hum of a bellows that someone left half-pumped, the echo of glass complaining where it rubs on wood. You push yourself up, and your fingers find the edge of the palette, rough oak, blackened where crucible splashes have scorched it. Your blanket smells faintly of horsehair and soot. Under it, a pouch of weighed lead shot clinks against your hip. Emergency waits for the balance, because you learned the hard way that the scales are the only true god in this room. The scales hang above the bench, brass pans dulled by flour dust and metallic films. Each weight used to be a promise, to measure truth out of chaos. Today they look like lies. The bench groans when you swing your legs over. The copper bellows wheeze rhythmically. Somebody left the coals dying and the hearth can't decide whether to smolder or sleep. You set a palm to the clay of the Athanor and feel the faint, steady warmth. The oven is the heart of your lab. Too slow and your sublimations fail. Too hot and your alembics turn traitor and crack. You put coal on the fire, shove the bellows down with a practiced heel, and the room accepts the breath as if you had exhaled an apology. The little flames lick at the underside of a crucible until it glows like a pale iron. You smell mercury before you see it, that cold, metallic, almost fruity reek that hangs heavier than air. A glass phial sits on its side near your mortar, a bead of quicksilver crawling like a silver slug. You touch the phial to test its weight, and the mercury rolls. A bead that reflects the window slit back at you, as if inspecting the world for flaws. You tell yourself not to handle it too much. You tell yourself many things this morning and break most of those promises by midday. Glassware lines a shelf like strange, translucent creatures. Alembics with bent necks, cucurbits that look like pottery stomachs, retorts that could have been made by a madbird. Venetian glass, you like to think thin, expensive, the kind that says the owner can afford to let things evaporate in style. A vial catches light and throws it back into your face. For a beat you are dazzled, then remember to blink away the sparks. Condensed droplets on the curve of an alembic look like pearls. You reach for one and your fingers slip. The drop runs, a cold bead that smells of iron and dissolving skin. You mutter something that would sound better in Latin. At the far end of the bench sits a poor heap of powders in waxed paper. Cinnabar, blood red as a murdered ruby. Orpiment, a sickly yellow that stains everything it touches. Verdigris, green as a coin and twice as treacherous. Each is a promise of wealth or death. The cinnabar is the most seductive mercury trapped in rock, waiting to be freed by heat. You know the method. Slow calcination, careful collection of fumes, patient coaxing. You also know the price, measured in tremors and teeth. You cup your nose by reflex and taste an apology. A small commotion at the door snaps you from your inventory. The apprentice stands there, cheeks flushed, a ratty cap in his hands. He has tried to be useful more times than he has succeeded, and today is a census of mistakes. He tells you quickly that the baker downstairs threatens to burn the whole building if you don't move the furnace further from the wall. His breath fogs in the slit air. You can already picture the baker's flinty jaw and the wag of his wife. No one likes soot where they need. You say you'll tell the bishop if the oven falls on them, which is to say nothing, because the bishop has other things to worry about. He releases a small sheepish smile and scrabbles for a clay pipe, thinking to offer you a peace pipe. You wave it away and he nearly drops it into the ash heap. You turn back to the bench and find the cat, the bastard of the workshop, a patchwork creature with more scars than a seasoned crusader, sitting in the middle of your papers, right where the recipe for aquavit lies open. For a second you imagine it has read it and decided to declare itself immortal. Instead it sneezes at the fumes and leaps, knocking an alembic so that it clinks against copper. You catch the glass rim before it tips, because years of clutching molten metal has made your reflexes stop being timid. The cat looks up, offended, and gives you the kind of look that, if it had hands, would thumb its nose at you. The bell over your door jingles. A woman outside hawks spices and small remedies from a basket: cloves, cinnamon, something in a paper you can't afford. She calls out that the milkman is late because the street is blocked, that someone saw a monk in a cloak carting away a book, and that the river smells worse than yesterday. You shout something about moving faster and hear the laugh of a child who has never had his boots filled with vinegar. The city is awake and loud, and thinks you are the oddity in the middle of it. The world expects a miracle from your bench, and you have laundry to do. You balance a spoonful of saltpeter and watch it hiss when it meets vinegar. A small cloud of acid steam curls away, eating at the cuticle of air. You lean in because you can't help yourself, because there's a promise in each smell, each tiny chemical betrayal. Niter will rise, fumes will condense, and maybe, something will separate into a gleam of gold. You cough and something metallic clatters on the floor. You bend to pick it up, the little brass tag from a patron's parcel, stamped with a seal that smells faintly of perfume and desperation. A noble's seal, perhaps. They will come for their elixir at noon and will want to know why nothing glints. You set the tag on the scale. It balances, indifferent, a metronome between desire and failure. Outside, a cart wheels by and the jolt makes the bellows sigh. A gull somewhere over the river cries like a small, wet sword. You take a breath and tell yourself the day is young. The Athenor hums, the mercury watches, the cat plans its next insurrection. You lift your pestle and the world contracts to the grind of stone against mineral, to the relief of powder turning finer beneath your hand. Sulfur hangs in layers in the light, a yellow smudge against the gray morning, and you can almost hear it whisper. Try again. You push the shutters open, and a thin blade of dawn slits through the smoke-stained air. It feels colder against your face than it should, and the back of your hand comes away with a gray smear you didn't know you had. The room exhales the same old bouquet. Bitter soot, something that was once sweet but is now astringent, and a faint, metallic tang that crawls up your nostrils and makes your eyes water. You wrinkle your nose and think, briefly and darkly, of the time you decided to distill morning breath from the fusty mouth of a monk. That, at least, was an experiment that taught you how far vanity can go. Your first task is simple, and, if you're honest, the thing you do before you do anything important. Check that none of your jars of volatile powders exploded while you slept. Volatile in this workshop means liable to make the whole lot of you regret the settlement of that last wager. The jars are varied things: thin, green glass bottles with lips rough from the grinder, stout glazed crocks with rope twine around their necks, a small, cracked albarello wrapped in beeswax, a wine bottle repurposed for saltpeter whose label is half obscured by soot. They stand on two sagging shelves that lean like old men, each lid sealed with pitch or cloth, each overturned at some point by the headlong life of this place. You have a ritual for them, a careful dance of checks that has kept you and your apprentices alive more times than you can count. You slide on a leather glove over one hand, the glove smelling faintly of oil and old vinegar, and take a wooden spatula from the rack. It's safer than a bare finger and less likely to spark than the brass spoon you once thought to use. You start at the left, the poorest lit shelf, and work right, lifting lids the way you lift the corner of a sleeping person's blanket, gently, waiting for a reaction. The first jar, a dull, powdery thing labeled in a monkish hand, salpetri, exhales a dry puff of chalk that flakes off into your palm. It smells faintly of dirt and the mouthwash of a horse. Saltpeter, useful for black powders when mixed with sulfur and charcoal, useful for making your neighbors jump when you test a mortar mix. It is, in its best state, a crystalline, sensible fellow. This batch is damp at the edges. The crystals have welded themselves into a hard cake where moisture found them during last night's draft. You tap it with the spatula. It rings like a bell to let you know it is stubborn but not murderous. You make a note in the margin of your ledger to dry it on the warm coals today. The next jar is an earthenware crock of sulfur, deep mustard color, smelling of the rotten eggs you ate last week, and the fire pit where you roast them. When you lift the cloth, the scent blooms heavier than expected. Sulfur can be flirtatious with flame, and there is a small, dark stain on the crock's rim where someone, maybe you, drunk on confidence, once let a coal rest too long. You blow on the mouth of the jar out of habit and regret it the instant the cloud of sulfur hits your tongue. The back of your throat prickles. You cough, and the apprentice, who is rummaging in a corner for something in the dark, startles so violently that he drops the pestle. It clatters across the workbench and bounces into a pile of old papers. The papers don't catch fire, but one margin has been blackened, and your neat notes about fractionated mercury now look like the handwriting of a man who ran out of hope. A small, quick sound prompts you to turn. The cat, an ill-tempered black thing that owes you nothing but the occasional mouse, has been sleeping between two jars and is now sneezing. A fine dust puffs from its whiskers, and the creature glares at you as if this is all your fault. Cats are notoriously unhelpful in alchemical circles. They like to test lids with their tails, and more importantly, lie in the one patch of sun that will warm a volatile jar into misbehaving. You flick a finger at it. It leaps and knocks a tiny glass vial at the edge of the shelf. The vial wobbles on the lip and in slow terror tips. You catch it with your elbow before it hits the floor. It was a vial of mercury quicksilver. It trembles, a small silver moon trapped within glass, and you breathe with relief so abruptly that you nearly dislodge a stack of crucible lids. You move on. A jar of orpiment, a russet-orange arsenic sulfide that glows like rust but kills like winter, is sealed with wax. When you tug the rag seal free, a dust motes up, bright and poisonous and arrogant. You turn away immediately, each breath careful and shallow. Orpiment is beautiful in a monstrous way. In the sunlight, it seems to hold a forge. You wrap your handkerchief over your mouth and loosen the window to let the air shift. It's the civil thing to do, and nothing about you is civil. You place a scrap of linen over the jar and mark it "handle with care" in a hand. That will be illegible to anyone else. There is a small disaster you didn't expect. The night was damp and one of the lids, sealed with pitch, has swelled and popped. The blast is not dramatic, a dry puff and a smear across the plaster where powder has kissed lime. But the smell is immediate and foul, a metallic, biting scent that makes your eyes sting. The plaster shows tiny pinprick marks where the powder scattered. A section of mortar has gone powdery under its influence. You scoop up the spill with a dustpan and cast it into a bucket of sand. Sand is your friend. You dampen the area with vinegar and salt, an old remedy for binding chemical escapees, and chalk the spot so the apprentice will know where not to set a burning coal. There are, of course, the usual smaller incidents that make the morning commute feel dramatic. The apprentice, having recovered from his earlier fright, barges in with a ledger and a debtor's list and nearly steps on a tray of glass retorts. You scold him, he blusters and blames the cat. You both end up laughing, which is a strange, sour sound in the room. Outside, someone shouts in the street, probably the spice merchant arguing with a buyer, and the sound travels through the thin walls. The commotion vibrates the shelves. You move faster, checking the remaining jars. Green vitriol, a pale blue powder that can piss and spit if heated. Sal ammoniac, sharp as the sea. A small, charred container of mercury chloride that has clearly been left too close to the furnace last night. The mercury chloride has fused into a hard, glittering bloom. It is useless now, but at least it did not explode. By the time you've gone through the row, wiped down the worst of the residues, and stacked the spare lids with a sort of desecrated respect, you feel the familiar tightness in your chest. The air is cleaner than it was, not by much, but enough for another day of bargaining with the volatile. You retie your sleeves with practiced fingers and set the wooden spatula back where it belongs. The jars that survived will be used, transformed, coaxed into secrets. The ones that sulked and swelled will be labeled and locked. You do not congratulate yourself. You have not earned it. But you stand upright, cup the breath that remains in your lungs, and try to look like a man who knows what he is doing. The cat watches you with the exact expression of a judge inked in soot, and you decide that for now, that must be good enough. You crouch before the furnace like a priest before an altar, though the worship here is heat and not holiness. The furnace is an ungainly beast, brick stomach blackened with old smoke, a slender throat that leads up into a crooked chimney, and a belly where the charcoal sits like coals in a dragon's maw. The ash bed is cold when you prod it with the poker. Gray scales crumble and a lazy wisp of dust floats up and stings your nostrils. You spit, taste iron and soot, and reach for the charcoal sack. Charcoal smells different from wood. It's a dry, compacted smoke, a smell of forests that went to cinders months ago and were given a cruel, useful second life. You slot pieces into the heart of the furnace and scatter ember dust from yesterday's fire into the gaps, coaxing contact where there was none. The first spark you strike with flint hisses like a small, offended animal. The spark catches, then pushes and becomes a glow, and then a whisper of flame. You blow once with the bellows, and the furnace answers with a hungry roar. Heat washes over your face, and you feel the fine beads of sweat gather at your hairline. Bellows are an instrument of trust. You grip the leather handles, flex your knees, and work the hinge in practiced rhythm. The pulse of the workshop falls into time with it. Inhale, exhale, blow, ember bloom. Each breath of the bellows is a measurement. Too aggressive and you'll starve the embers with a flood of air. Too timid and the heat will drift into a frustrated simmer. Today you need true flame. The crucible must be brought up to a milk of metal glow for the first melt. You set an iron rod in the hearth to test the temperature, watch its tip darken and then take on a dull, threatening orange. This is the language of fire, color, tone, the tiny hissing of scale forming on iron. You know what an orange core will do to copper ore, and what a white glare will do to silver. You know which leaks of heat will ruin an alembic, and which will make the mercury dance into poisonous vapor. You scold yourself aloud for the little pleasures, then snort because scolding is a comfort as much as an order. A small side incident interrupts your sermon to the furnace. Your apprentice, Lucas, bursts in trailing a candle and a cloud of nonsense. He's rubbed soot on his cheek to look older and has managed to burn a sleeve in the process. He yelps when he notices the bellows and trips over a coil of rope, sending a tray of glass vials clinking. One hops and skitters off the table and shatters against the stone floor. You do not shout. Your breath is too occupied with tending the fire. Instead, you pull Lucas back from the hearth with a cool hand on his shoulder and tell him to fetch the iron clamp and the tongs. He obeys, sheepish, the comic drama of the workshop folding back into the serious business of flames. You snip a small twig, rub the tip in vinegar, then drop it into the embers. The vinegary smoke curls and tastes of sour apples, and somewhere in the back of your head a teacher's voice tells you how acids change things. You let the twig glow and then plunge it into water to see the steam. These petty experiments are a form of control, tests to remind you that nature can be directed, if only a little. You have several retorts ready on a shelf, each jeweled with labels in your cramped hand. Cinnabar for mercury, niter, sulfur, and a pinch of orpiment stashed in a wooden box that smells faintly of garlic. The alchemist's language is partly trade, names for materials that you can buy in the markets, and partly superstition, names for things that sound holy enough that a wealthy patron will trust you to handle them. You set the retorts near the furnace entrance so they feel the gentlest warmth first. Heat must be staged. Sudden rage will crack glass and ruin centuries of careful scribbles. Another side incident. A rat bold from the alleyways makes a run along the sill and nearly steals a roll of beeswax. The rat's fur catches a spark, and for a heartbeat it looks like a tiny, frantic comet. Lucas lunges with a broom and misses, scattering beeswax, and you have to laugh. There's humor even in danger here. It's a dry, sharp laugh, the sort that clears your throat and your mind. You chase the rodent away, pinching your nostrils against the smell of scorched fur and wax. You arrange the crucible into the heart of the fire, nestling it into support bars and tamping embers around its sides so heat will envelope it. The crucible is a small, sacred pot. Pound it wrong and it will shiver and break. You coach it gently into the bed as if it understands your coaxing. You add a touch of flux, borax you bought from a Venetian trader, a little to strip the sand and free the metal. Flux is magic and alchemy both, a practical chemical to pull metal from sorrow and a charm to sell to the superstitious. Smoke curls at your face, tasting now of vinegar and a metallic tang that makes your tongue go numb at the edges. You chew a clump of mastic to clean your teeth and breath before a patron comes in. It's a superstition that your breath should taste pleasant when negotiating with the gullible. The soot scratches your throat, and your hands are stained in the charcoal blue you can never quite wash away. Your mind flicks ahead to what you will attempt today, a small alloy meant to mimic a noble's prized coinage, a dissolution of silver so fine it might fool an unpracticed eye. But first, kiln building. You must coax the chill out of the glassware, make sure the alembic doesn't surprise you with a shatter. You fit clay around the retort joints, pressing like a mason repairing a wall. The thinness of the glass is a constant anxiety. Breakage is both waste and omen. Many of the craft's old superstitions began as rational warnings about fragile tools. Another small flurry. A messenger knocks and slides a scrap of paper under the furnace door, 2 words hastily scrawled. It's a noble's request. He's impatient, they say. You toss the slip into your pocket as if it were a hot coal. You will answer, but not yet. The furnace must be fed. As the fire climbs, you feel something that is more than warmth, authority. The workshop leans into you. The bellows' breath is yours now, steady and confident. The metal at the crucible lip coheres, the glass in the retort wets and gleams. Air that once smelled of yesterday's accidents and vinegar now tastes of possibility. You close your eyes for a second and map the next moves. When to add mercury, when to cupel, how to coax the fumes into the alembic's neck rather than into your lungs. The furnace is ready, and so are you, for the day's small miracles and inevitable misfires. The mortar sits on the workbench like a small island of dark rock, heavy enough to make the whole table groan when you set it down. It is pitted and polished from decades of use. Someone before you dragged it across stone floors, slammed it with a blunt pestle, and left a rim rimmed with old, baked-on stains. You lift the pestle. It is a slab of oak wrapped in leather at the grip, its head blackened where it has struck metal and stone so often that the grain has closed over. It feels, in your palm, like a cudgel with a scholar's purpose. You pour the first mineral into the bowl. Malachite, velvet green chunks, veined with lighter bands, clinks and settles with the sound of small stones. You taste the air anyway because habit is a kind of calendar. A hint of sulfur on the inhale, a residue of vinegar on the exhale. Your fingers are stained with everything from verdigris to the faint shadow of mercury. They are the map of your trades. You place a scrap of coarse linen over the mortar to slow the worst of the dust. Folk teach you to do that when the powders are treacherous. Folk also die young. You bring the pestle down. The first blow is a shock to the wrist, a compression that sends a small orchestra of grit up your arm. The malachite shatters into rough green shards. On the second beat, the pieces sigh into a powder, emerald snow blown into the bowl by the force. The room fills with a faint metallic taste that you feel first on the front of the tongue and then deeper in the molars. It is a premonition, chemical and honest. You work in economy of motion. Wrist, elbow, shoulder. Each strike measured to be hard enough to crush but not so violent as to fling jade dust into the air where it will settle on your lungs. Grinding is rhythm. It is the slow music of the workshop. Thud, scrape. Your heart finds cadence with the pestle. You time your breath to the motion so that when the pestle rises, your lungs inhale away from the dust. When it falls, your mouth is closed. This is the modest protection of experience. Linen over the nose, an old shirt collar drawn up. No mask of brass. You count under your breath. 1, 2, 1, 2. Your knuckles ache where they strike occasionally against the bowl. The pestle is heavy for a reason. The weight does half the work. Your job is the coaxing. Halfway through, you pull the green powder aside and run a small shaker of clean sand through it, as a tempering agent, to see how the mineral will respond when blended for pigments or for copper preparations. The sand ticks into the bowl like tiny beads. You flick the pestle and watch the particles mingle, black and green dancing in a miniature storm. You scrape some onto the back of your hand with a fingernail and sniff. The scent is sharper now, like struck copper in a wet forge. A knock at the door interrupts the cadence. It is quick, officious, one of the city's cloth sellers, the one with a habit of arriving at the worst minute and expecting miracles. He thrusts his head in, alert and ashamed at the same time, and immediately recoils from the smell. You tell him to wait. He complains about a stain on his wife's skirt. You tell him you are not a tailor. He presses a coin into your palm with flour-dusted fingers and insists on an elixir for a delicate constitution. You smile and pocket the coin. The pestle keeps moving through your other hand, ever the metronome. A sudden sneeze from the apprentice near the door sends a breath of cold air in, and a scattering of fine green dust over the edge of the bench. The apprentice freezes, mortified, hands raised like a boy expelled from mass. You glance up, annoyed more than afraid. This dust is mostly malachite, an annoyance more than a murderer. Still, the apprentice's cheeks go white and he steps backward, knocking his oil lamp. It tips but someone. Thank the saints, it's your neighbor's cat. Paws at the lamp and righting it with a slap that sends the cat yowling and the oil sloshing harmlessly onto the flagstone. You laugh once, a dry sound that sticks in your throat. The laugh seals the room back to its rhythm. When you are turning malachite into something like powder, you set it through a coarse sieve. The bits that remain are stubborn, chalky, and you grind them longer until they relent. Some minerals are obstinate. Some give up their secrets quickly, like a miser counting coins. Cinnabar, for instance, bright red as fresh blood and just as dangerous, demands a gentler hand and a different trick. You never grind cinnabar dry. You moisten it with a drop of vinegar to stop the worst of the dust and to begin the slow work that will later, under iron and heat, release the sheen of mercury. The vinegar hisses faintly on hot hands. A bead of sweat slips into the mortar and you curse softly as it whites the powder for a heartbeat. Side incidents keep arriving, small as mice and as trying. A hawker below your window calls up a gust of street sound. Ducks, a bell, a shout about a stolen robe. You pause, pestle in air to listen. The sound of the street makes the workshop feel like a hiding place. You set one ear to the mortar to feel how the grit is changing. The pestle's dull thud shifts to a flatter, more sibilant rhythm, proof that the particles are getting fine. Occasionally you test the powders as you work. A pinch brushed onto a hot plate will change color, steam, or flame, and tell you what it wants to become. You touch a sliver of malachite to a heated iron and it darkens, then gives a faint green sheen that disappears into smoke. A neighbor, a painter by trade, leans over to peer and mistakes the taste of the fumes for progress. He jokes about painting a cathedral with pigments cheaper than the architect's stones. You reply that he'd better not ask for your recipe unless he wants his children's noses green for life. The final grind is a ceremony. You adjust your stance, plant both feet, and press the pestle down until the mortar hums with compacted dust. The surface of the powder looks like velvet under moonlight, dense, even, impossibly fine. You tug the linen away and cup a portion in your hand. It feels like talc. You let it fall back into the bowl and watch it bloom, a faint mist that hangs for a heartbeat before settling. You smear a little between thumb and forefinger. Your skin takes on a ghost of verdigris that will not wash away until the next week of labor. You label the scrap of parchment that will go with this batch. A neat hand, as much for the future as for any customer. Malachite ground dry, sifted fine. You tuck the parchment into the jar and press the lid down with a sense of small victory. Another mineral made obedient. Another experiment catalogued. Still, you wash your hands at the basin because ritual and cleanliness are two sides of the same coin in this house. The water runs cold and the soap is limeade and biting. Your skin goes raw under the nails. You cough once, a small, unconcerned sound, and wonder with a humorless smile how many of your colleagues finished a day like this and never woke to repeat it. You are not immortal. You are, at least, careful. When the mortar finally empties and the pestle rests against the bowl like an exhausted sentinel, the workshop is quiet enough to hear the settling of dust. The green on your hands gleams in the lamplight and you think briefly, because you always do, about the next mineral you will. Break something harder, more secretive, maybe poisonous, certainly worth coin. The work continues. Your palm still remembers the rhythm. You pick up the pestle again, and though the night presses, do not notice the cold. The alchemical life is slow, stubborn, and stubbornly loud in small moments. You prefer it that way. You lay the last of the coals into the brazier, and the room settles into a low, hungry glow. The manuscripts are stacked on the table like sleeping beasts. Folios of heavy vellum, a stitched quires, a palimpsest whose earlier life shows through like a bruise. The air around them tastes of iron and dust. When you lift the topmost sheet, the scent of old glue and insect oil rises off the page, and for a moment you might believe these books are alive, or that they are, at least, aware of you. Ink sits on the pages in confident, looping hands. Some of it is a tight Gothic script. Some is an Arabian hand translated into clumsy Latin. There are margins full of scrawled notes, sigils like crab claws and suns with faces, and the occasional obscene sketch that the original scribe must have thought very clever. The first thing you do is not to hunt for gold or elixir. You look for mistakes. No secret can survive a scribal error. Your finger traces a line, vitriol. The letters are larger, almost shouted. You mouth the expansion out loud without meaning to, visita interior terri rectificando in vinis occultum lapidum, and the syllables hang in the smoke like a charm. It is both a joke and a map. The text recommends digging inward, burning away, purifying. It promises the hidden stone. It also promises a headache. You smile despite yourself. The manuscripts always do. They promise the world and hide the work in metaphor. You read for patterns. Every recipe repeats a handful of verbs. Resolve, calcine, distill, cohabitate in the alembic. Each verb drags with it a list of odors you recognize. Sulfur's rotten egg stink, the sharp metallic tang when mercury collides with acid, the sweet rot of putrefaction. One recipe calls for the white of the moon joined to the red of Mars and draws two tiny circles, a crescent and a spear. Beneath, a later hand has written in the vernacular, "Mix a little copper and tin." It runs like piss and smells of vinegar. The later scribe is practical, vulgar, right. You test as you read. You take a sliver of stannum from the tray and bring it to the brazier. The book tells you to watch how it behaves when presented to gentle heat, whether it blackens, whether it gives off a white smoke, whether it weeps oil. Science, of a sort. Observation is the one thing more reliable than words. The metal curls like a sleeping eel. You jot a note in the margin in your own cramped hand. Tin becomes soft, smells sour. The ink is nearly as dark as the metal's shadow. The texts are layered. One leaf is a palimpsest, an older prayer scraped away so the vellum could be reused, the ghost of saintly text still visible beneath. To the right, a long recipe from Pseudo-Geber, a man who writes like a god and cheats like a borrower at market. His hand is showy, all grand gestures and allegory. To the left, a simple butcher of an apothecary has written corrections in the margins, "Do this and not this." You like the butcher. He tells you which steps explode less often. A moth, gray as old smoke, beats into the lamp and sets off a brief outbreak of wing-beaten splendor. It smudges a tiny round of grease into the margin of a diagram. You curse softly. The lamp's sputter sends a droplet of oil across the page. You press a finger to the stain and feel the vellum absorb it like a memory. For a minute, you are more careful with the book than with the crucible. Books are harder to replace than a cracked glass. A scrap of parchment flutters from between leaves, a note folded small, written in the hand of your late mentor. "When the ink blackens, the heart does not," it says. You had almost forgotten his voice. For a second you picture him at the bench, fingers stained, mouthing oaths at a retort that wouldn't condense. The thought steadies you. People die and leave notes, recipes survive. You are now responsible for both. A quick commotion from the doorway. One of the apprentices, pale and panicked, has realized his cat has decided the pile of filings was a suitable latrine. The apprentice scrabbles, swears, and begins plucking silver shavings from under the cat while you keep reading. The interruption is small and human. It punctures the manuscript's sanctity in the perfect way, a reminder that theory meets filth and often loses. Back at the page, you encounter a diagram like a constellation, planetary glyphs orbiting a central square. The text instructs you to bind the metals according to days of the week. Saturday for Saturn, Sunday for Sol. It is superstition dressed as schedule. But then there are procedural notes, heat here, quench there, that sounds suspiciously like an oven timetable. You realize how much of alchemy is calendar. Timing when you heat, when you let a tincture stand, when you expose a solution to moonlight. The manuscript is as much a clock as a recipe. You come upon a rubric in red. The negrito will take you below the earth. It promises the blackening that precedes rebirth. You lean in, as if proximity will make the blackness speak. You have spent long nights watching solutions turn black as a dead thing, and then, sometimes, surprise you with a sudden lift to pearl white. That is the magic and the mundane of it. 100 hours of soot followed by a slim chance of a gleam. You trace the dance of stages with your fingertip, negrito to albedo to citrinitas to rubido. Even the names comfort, they pretend progress is inevitable. Another side incident. A man from the street barges in without knocking, smelling of ale and boasting of his own secret knowledge. He drops a scrap of paper on the bench, a recipe scrawled in a hand as close to forgery as his breath is to the lamp. He demands to know if this will make the coins true. You read the page. It is nonsense, a child's spell. You tell him the truth, which is cheaper and angrier. It will make you poorer. He leaves, embarrassed but persistent. The conversation costs you nothing but time and a dampening of the romantic aura. Good. Near the back of one vellum, a scribe has drawn a tiny face beside a recipe and labeled it "Beware." Beside that, in a more genteel hand, someone has added a practical addendum. Use earthen pot for this, else you will taste lead. The annotations are the lifeblood of these manuscripts. They turn impossible allegory into something that might, occasionally, not kill you. You mark the promising pages with string. A page on mercury distillation, a gloss on sublimation, a recipe for a spirit that smells of green apples and will, if mishandled, leave you coughing for a week. You close the book and the room feels smaller, fuller. Outside the window a cart rolls by, wheels crunching gravel, a dog barks. Inside, among the curling letters and the authority of dust, you have choices. The books give you instructions and riddles. You must translate both. By the time you blow out the lamp, your eyes sting and the last line you read is some old adage. He who would know must not be content with the first thing seen. You nod. You are not content. You are never content. The pages will wait for morning, but you will not. Tonight you sleep with the open manuscript on your chest like a talisman, listening to the house settle and the ink dry, thinking of all the small, safe errors you will make tomorrow, and the one big, spectacular one that might, by accident, be useful. You lift the vial of quicksilver and watch it roll like night light across the wooden table, a cold, liquid moon trapped in glass. It makes the small sound of a coin flicked on a table as you tap the neck and let a few beads spill into the fire clay crucible. Mercury runs in perfect, silver pearls, unnervingly alive. The old recipe in your head tells you that mercury is the metal's soul, brimstone the spirit. You don't truly believe in cute little souls, but belief is the language of patrons and manuscripts. You believe in results. The hearth is a low, angry maw. You shove a handful of charcoal into the furnace, force the bellows with your thigh until the air is a hot, insistent hand. The crucible hears the heat and begins to sing, soft at first, then higher, the voice of a metal getting hot enough to do terrible things. You sprinkle in the sulfur, a fine yellow dust that smells faintly of rotten eggs even before it's touched by flame. The powder settles on the mercury as if a sunlit dusting, looking harmless, almost comically bright against the liquid silver. You should open a window. You know this. But the rain has got the shutters pasted shut, and every draft is a guest you do not want while you coax vapors. You reason you'll work quickly. The first heat is gentle, then a push. The sulfur browns, curls, and then blooms into that particular smell, a sharp, acrid sting that reaches the back of your throat and makes your eyes sting. It is as if the world has been reduced to one single, punitive taste. The mercury starts to shimmer. Tiny columns of vapor rise from the surface and catch the light like cigarette smoke from an angel's mustache. They meet the sulfur in the air and perform a cruel marriage. The fumes curl and press against the aludel, the tall earthenware tube you fit over the crucible to catch whatever can be coaxed into a substance that shows itself on colder surfaces. The aludel is your safe theory until it is not. First, you cough. It's a small, involuntary thing, an apology from your body. Your apprentice, a lanky boy with ink-stained fingers and a permanent look of either awe or terror, presses his handkerchief to his mouth and thinks that's enough. He thinks wrong. The fumes are both sweet and foul. A metallic tang belts the back of your tongue. The room has the odd contrast of earthy clay and sulfuric brightness. Your throat tightens like a fist. You know the old proverbs. If you want vermilion, you'll share a little of your life for color. There is triumph in the thought. Vermilion is worth more than a sackful of wheat, but triumph tastes like pennies in your mouth when you cough up a mouthful of bitter phlegm. Your lungs say they are not pleased. A small incident. Your cat, feathered ears and bell for mischief, leaps onto the bench and sniffs at a bead of mercury with a disdainful flick. You whack the cat away because pets do not belong near crucibles, and the cat arches and slams into a cluster of glass alembics. The crash is comic and mortal at once. Glass screams and falls, and for half a breath you think you'll need to explain a broken alembic to the neighbor. The boy blames the cat, which only makes the cat rub against his leg as if it has done nothing wrong. You regret the noise more than the breakage. That alembic was old but useful. The cat's whiskers twitch. It eyes the spreading red, where vapor has already begun to condense on the cool lip of the aludel. A second, shorter commotion. 2 doors down, a voice yells, "What foulness comes from your shop?" It's the tallow chandler, his face turned purple with mock outrage, bringing the whole street's attention in a way you do not want. You mutter something about pigments and parchment and the noble's portrait that must be finished, and he stomps away, muttering about witchcraft. Your skin prickles. The last thing you want is a procession of the worried and the righteous milling about because you insist on making bright paint in a room that doubles as your bed. Above all this, the coughing, the cat, the chandler's moralizing, the alchemical moment arrives, where the vapors meet the colder mouth of the aludel they redden, like sunset trapped in clay. A fine, gleaming deposit forms. Cinnabar the ancient and immodest red. It looks like crushed rubies, and for a second you feel like a god who has made the sun blush. You scrape the crimson with a spatula. The powder comes away in a damp, glistening ribbon. It is beautiful in the way that danger is beautiful, alluring, sharp, and fatal if you make the mistake of caressing it too long. Another cough, rougher now, your chest clenches. Sweat purls at your temples despite the cold draft you finally admit to opening. The boy is pale. His hands shake as he fans the window to get the fumes out. Yet there are coins to be had. The red pigment will illuminate a monk's manuscript, will make a noble's banner bold. You tell yourself that artistry requires sacrifice. The thought is almost heroic until you feel the metallic tremor in your fingers and realize the sacrifice may be more literal than you meant. Your throat catches on words you try to say. The cat grooms its paw on the bench and leaves a smear of red across the wood, a vulgar signature. You laugh, a small, sharp bark that almost chokes itself. The laugh is a prayer and an offering. You scrape more cinnabar, keep the aludel at a steady, dangerous temperature, coaxing the fumes to travel where you can recover them and not decorate your lungs with them. You wear no mask. Masks are rare and thick linen is useless, but you keep the scrubbed brass tongs between your face and the worst of the smoke. The tongs are a theater prop, the sort of effort that makes patrons feel safe. You remember a line from a faded pamphlet: "Sulfur loves mercury as fire loves breath." It is both poetic and a cautionary tale. You think of the old alchemists who scrawled diagrams in a hand so tiny you had to squint to read them. You think of others who disappeared and were said to have found the secret. You sweep those thoughts away because superstition is for other people's comfort. You focus on the red powder on the spatula, the way light eats it and spits ruby back at you. The fumes thin because of the draft and because the crucible is cooling. The boy tucks the aludel into the sink to rinse at once, and you realize how reckless that is. Water and cinnabar mix into something you don't want to think about. You slap his hand away. He swears in a language you maybe taught him, then apologizes like it's a prayer. Outside, the chandler has stomped off, but your nose remembers him. The smell of sulfur and pennies will follow you for days. You are left with a pile of vermilion, a burned sleeve, a hoarse voice, and a laugh that tastes like iron. You wrap the pigment in oilcloth and tie it with string, commerce with one hand, calamity with the other. You feel a buzzing in the joints of your fingers that will likely grow familiar over years, and not in a kind way. The boy fetches wine and a bowl of broth, and will tell patrons you were exhausted from study. You will not tell them it was the fumes. In the small hours, when the cat curls by your head and the aludel sits empty like a carved tooth, you will scrape your hands and find a trace of red in the grooves of your nails. The color will be worth more than a meal. It will, in its own quiet way, be proof. Proof that you can take two opposites and marry them and make something that stops a monk in his copying and makes a duke pay a price. Proof that you can make beautiful things while your lungs file complaints. And you will cough again, lower and longer this time, like a bell tolling for all your small grand plans. You crouch by the hearth, fingers black with soot and copper filings, and set the alembic into the glowing mouth of the furnace. The head of the vessel fits like a crooked crown over the cucurbit. Where metal meets glass, you wrap toe soaked in wet clay to keep the seal from leaking steam. Outside the window, the street vendors call, but inside the room the only voices are the hiss of charcoal, the clink of glass, and the soft, worried breathing of your apprentice. Vinegar steams in the belly of the cucurbit. a murky brown made from old wine and a year's worth of household scraps. You top it with a sliver of sour wine that you saved for precisely this purpose, to coax more spirit into the vapors. It's an ugly, useful liquid. Peasants barter for it, surgeons bathe wounds in it, tailors loosen dyes with it. You're about to squeeze from it something sharper, a concentrated ghost the apothecaries will sell for a crown a vial. You fit the length of glass tubing, a slender, hand-blown snake, into the alembic's head. The glass is cloudy in the places where the blower's breath met the cold, but it's strong enough if you handle it right. You loop the tubing into a trough of cool water. The air around the coil fogs as the vinegar vapor meets the skin of the glass and surrenders itself, condensing to a clear, biting drop that runs into the receiver. The condenser glitters like a small, modern river, and you watch, hungry as a hunter, for the first beads to fall. The smell hits you before you see the liquid. Acetic scent, so sharp it makes your eyes water and the hair on your forearms lift, crawls up the back of your throat. It stings your nose, makes your lungs want to cough and your mouth purse. You move your sleeve across your face and curse softly. The apprentice fumbles with a brass clamp and drops a ceramic mortar. It shatters into a constellation of white shards on the stones. He swears and scrambles, and you snap at him to hold the bellows steady. He does, hands trembling. Drops of clear spirit begin to bead at the lip of the receiver, cold, almost glassy, like dew. You lift the receiver to your nose and inhale through clenched teeth. The perfume is nothing like the sweet wines you trade in the market. This is cruel, medicinal, honest. It bites and clears. You allow yourself a small grin. For the right use, a few spoonfuls will disinfect a wound, stir a stubborn dye, or brighten a courtier's stained hands. In the wrong hands, it eats through brass and flesh. You proof the distillate the way you've learned to judge everything in this trade. By sight, smell, and a pinch of bravado. A tiny dab on the back of your wrist puckers skin, and you immediately swamp the spot in water. The apprentice, whose curiosity is a constant hazard, asks if it can burn. Your answer is a story. Once an old apothecary set a strip of cloth soaked in his distillate to flame as a test. The cloth did not burn, it crackled and smoked, and the old man's sneeze launched the flame into his robe. He lost an eyebrow and kept his recipes. You tell the tale with a wry twist, then cuff the apprentice and tell him not to repeat the experiment. As the second cupful streams into the receiving vessel, you note the color. Almost colorless, a hint of straw. The old vinegar, what alchemists call the base, remains stubborn in the cucurbit. It tastes like yesterday's market. You scrape the inside of the alembic with a spoon between runs, trying to coax the last of the volatile spirit free. The glass sings under the spoon's edge, a thin, keening sound. A commotion at the door interrupts you. A messenger pushes in. His cloak damp with river water, he announces a noble's impatience. "Faster," he hisses. The countess insists on spirits to bathe a rash. You hide your smile. No, you do not promise her anything supernatural. You tell him truthfully that you will have a small phial by evening, and you say it with a tone that's part apology, part threat. The messenger sneers but departs with a clatter of boots. You return to your work. The glass tubing sweats, and tiny beads of condensate run back like nervous mice. The air grows more sour, and the metal of the furnace glows a darker orange. You adjust the bellows to a quieter rhythm. Too hot and the alembic will crack. Glass is beautiful but brittle. One wrong surge, and the whole apparatus explodes into a dangerous rain. You picture a shower of molten glass across your bench. You picture the apprentice's face when he realizes he'll never be alchemist if he's blind. Side incident. A rat slips across the threshold, brazen as a thief, and slips a paw into an overturned sack of dried herbs. You frown and snap at it. The apprentice tosses a scrap of stale bread to distract it. It works. The rat volleys the bread into a corner and gnaws so loudly you can imagine its teeth mark the rhythm of your failures. Rats are the only true audience you have sometimes. They do not expect gold. Side incident 2. A neighbor's child appears at the open shutter carrying a tin cup, begging for a draught of strong vinegar to settle a fever. You weigh the child with one look, fevered, skin clammy, and hand over a spoonful of the spirit diluted in water. The mother presses coins into your palm later, grateful, her voice so low you almost miss the words. You saved him. It's not immortality, but it pays for coal. The receiver fills, and you break the seal with the calm of someone who has seen bottles explode and apprentices faint. You decant the clear juice into little phials, cork them tight with rags soaked in wax, and label them with a scratch of ink. Spiritus aceti, purified. You store the first bottles in the shadowed shelf behind your bed. The rest will be carried to market, to the barber surgeon, to the tailor who dyes velvets. People will pay for the sharpness that cuts through rot and rust. The taste in your mouth lingers long after you stop testing. Your throat feels raw, and in the corner of your eye, a faint film of white forms on the glass you handled too long, a residue that will not wipe away easily. You dip a rag into the remaining distillate, intending to test its use on a rusted bit of iron, and you watch as the metal brightens under the acid's bite. It's a small, satisfying alchemy, dull iron to glinting edge, a servant of utility rather than legend. You sit back and listen to the house settle. The alembic hisses a last complaint as the heated vapors finally abate. The coil fogs and clears, and the receiver reflects the dim light like a small moon. Outside, laughter and cartwheels pass, oblivious. Inside, in the hush after boiling, you feel the work as a ledger closing. A measured victory, not miraculous but profitable and true. You close the shutter, hide the bottles away, and write down the yield in your ledger with a nib now stained from years of ink and soot. It's not gold. It's the thing the world wants more often. Something to rub on wounds, to cut through tarnish, to steady a feuding hand. You could sell it for coin, for goodwill, for a scrap of reputation that does not smell of smoke and failure. Tonight, boiled vinegar becomes something purer, not in the way the sages promised the cosmos, but in the way a useful, deliberate blade is purer than a rumor. You blow out the lamp and let the night keep the smell for itself. You lay the coins on the workbench like offerings. Copper pewter, a handful of battered farthings with the king's face worn away, all of them ordinary, blunt things that pay rent and buy bread, not the glittering sovereigns your patron imagines. The furnace glows low, a living thing beneath a belly of fire brick. You run the bellows once, twice, feeling the hot breath wash over your face. The room smells sharp now. Singed hair, iron tang, the greasy perfume of animal fat used to stoke flames. Your palms are dark with soot. Under your nails, the dust of a dozen failed attempts has ground into a permanent map. You speak aloud a few words from a marginal note you've memorized because the actual book is too precious to touch until you can afford a new pair of gloves. Some ritual, some nonsense. Whether it's prayers to Hermes or the scribbled exhortations of an Arab master, it doesn't matter. Words are a way to steady your hands. The apprentice kneels beside you, eyes too bright, fingers trembling as they pass you a little phial of quicksilver, mercury, liquid silver that moves like it has a will. The stuff beads on the bench like a constellation come loose. You never like the way it looks, all those tiny moons sliding between the cracks in the boards. You never liked the way people thought of it as the secret. There are small accidents before the main catastrophe. The first is almost absurd. The cat, a broad-shouldered beast that insists it is an assistant, snakes along the shelf and knocks a vial. It shatters with a smell like copper pennies in your mouth. You curse, sweep the shards into a scrap bucket, and for a pulse you imagine the sound of glass laughing at you. The second is more troublesome. A neighbor's apprentice arrives, panting, to demand repayment for a debt. He stomps a boot through a puddle of cold lead you left cooling in a tray. The lead tracks through the workshop like a train, leaving dull gray footprints that will be hard to remove. The third thing is quieter. An old monk who'd asked for invisible ink earlier slides his folded parchment across the bench. He looks at your setup, then at the coins, and says in a voice that smells of cassia and old vellum, "You'll have to be more persuasive." He pats the pouch on his belt as if to show he has no more coin for persuasion to give. You set to the serious work with a surgeon's focus. You grind, you cupel, you try to coax metals into behaving with the coaxing of fire. The terms ring through your skull: calcination, distillation, solution, coagulation, and you perform them like rites. You mix a powder that smells faintly of rotten eggs and sweet rot. A chemical word you use is vitriol, and the apprentices flinch when you say it, though they don't understand more than the name. The crucible heats. The metal goes from dull to red to a fierce, molten orange that makes you squint. Your breath fogs the air, carrying with it something acidic that stings the back of your throat. For a terrifying, perfect minute, the metal takes on a sheen you have only seen in the dreams of patrons. A warm, deep yellow that makes your heart lurch. It is almost gold. Then everything goes wrong in the fashion of things that have been waiting for years to go wrong. You've been too eager with the bellows. The apprentice, startled by a shout outside, someone down the street has begun a fight over a cheated dice game, overfeeds the furnace. The heat bites harder than before. A seal cracks, a retort you rely on groans. A trapped vapor, you never could tell properly how much you were driving away and how much you were trapping, finds a weakness. There is a sound like glass sighing, then a sharp report as if someone has struck a bell with a hammer. The crucible shatters inward, molten metal hissing as it spills onto the bricks. A spray of orange beads arcs out and splashes across the bench. One clinker lands in a heap of lawless papers and books, and a page curls up as if in pain. The effect is immediate and grotesque and oddly theatrical. Black smoke blooms, heavy and foul, smelling of brimstone and pickled fish and burning hair. The monk coughs, his face turning a worried white as he scrambles backward, dropping the parchment that had been his invisible ink test. The apprentice screams when a bead of metal drips down the iron frame of the furnace and sizzles through the leather on his glove. The cat, appalled by its own bravery, bolts across the rafters and scatters dust like a fresh snowfall. Someone outside yells, and you know the street has turned to a spectacle. When the smoke clears enough for sight, the gold is there, but only for a second. It is a skin, a glossy crust on top of a dark core, a deceptive smile that breaks under the touch. You pick at it with a poker, and it flakes away like overpainted tin. Beneath it, the metal is base and ordinary, a gray of disappointment. The noble who has stuck his head in gilded embroidery at his sleeve, catching the dying light, flings his hands and calls you a charlatan. The monk's parchment is charred at the edge. The invisible ink has been rendered visible only by ash, a macabre trick. There is another, quieter catastrophe that follows. You smell a metallic sweetness at the back of your mouth, the copper bitter of fumes that have touched your inside. Your tongue takes on a taste like coins after rain. You cough until you taste blood. The apprentice's hands shake. His hair has singed into tight black curls. The neighbor's apprentice stands in the doorway, white-faced and clutching a boot that now bears a scarlet scorch mark where a stray ember landed. Someone laughs at the wrong time, a brittle sound that you hate yourself for joining. You articulate a litany of apologies like a penitent. You sweep. You scrape. You try to patch the furnace with wet clay and an oath. You pick at the crust and see how thin it is, how artful the lie. The noble demands recompense. The monk calculates how much of his donation the accident has eaten. The apprentice, cheeks streaked with soot, scoops up the beads of quicksilver from the cracks because you taught him to value everything. The mercury beads look like a small fallen sky, and he cups them with a reverence that is almost religious. You slap a coin into the noble's hand. His face is a study in poor manners and greater loss, and he storms away muttering about fraud. The day ends in the usual way, with more cleaning than success, and with the sort of private, bitter humor you only share with soot-stained mirrors. You sit on the cold threshold and let the smoke clear. Your hands are a map of the morning, clawed with black. The bench is scarred, the books are singed, and your latest gold lies in a scrap bucket, a lump of nothing more than a lesson with a crown-shaped bruise. You laugh, a soft, animal sound that is mostly resignation. You think of the next attempt already, because you cannot bring yourself to dwell in failure, and because every failure smells, faintly, like a hint of possibility. You stand over a wooden table scarred by centuries of chopping and scorch marks, and the room smells of boiled roots and old wine. A basin of rainwater darkens the plank at your elbow where the spent herbs drain. Light from a narrow window slices across the workbench and makes the rim of a glass alembic gleam like a small moon. Today's task is simple in theory. Take what grows in hedgerows and marketplaces and make it stop the coughing, the fever, the wasting away. In practice, it is half theology, half chemistry, and entirely an exercise in plausible hope. The mortar is heavy in your hand. You grind willow bark until the powder smells faintly of green wood and soap, nature's aspirin, though no one around here would call it that. Beside the pestle lie meadowsweet, yarrow, and the bitter dried root of gentian. You pinch a little of the gentian between your fingers and wince. It tastes of iron and the cold bite of winter. You chant the recipes under your breath, Dioscorides, a marginal note from a Moorish translator, an old friar's scribbled amendment, stitching together authorities like a tailor mends a cloak. You burn a handful of rue to fumigate the rack where the powders sit. Its acrid smoke makes your sinuses open and your eyes water. Rue will do in a pinch for miasmas and the neighborhood superstitions. For a salve, you scrape comfrey into a pan with goose grease and honey until it smells of roasted leaves and warm bread. The honey darkens and bubbles and you finger it, not too sweet, not too bitter. Don't look to it for miracles, you tell yourself. The swelling of bone and flesh is stubborn and old. A lad clatters into the doorway, your apprentice, more hair than sense. He holds up a vial as if he's found treasure. Saffron is bloody expensive, master, he whispers, eyes wide. He tries to set it down and knocks a jar of powdered alum into the bowl. The alum fizzles on the hot pan and sends a puff of white that makes the apprentice sneeze. One sneeze and a cloud of dust shoots across the workbench into the alembic's neck. You slap the lid on, more to keep him from poking than to keep in fumes. The side incident is over in a heartbeat. A curse, a lecture, the apprentice's embarrassed grin as he mops up. You tuck the saffron away for tinctures reserved for wealthy patrons. It stays expensive and therefore useful for persuasion. Distillation is where people think you conjure spirits. You fit the glass head to the pot and watch as the water beneath the heated mass begins to shiver. Drops form on the cooled neck, bead, and run like tiny glass tears into the receiver. The distilled essence of rosemary smells of pine and old leather. You breathe it in and it steadies your hands. A few drops with wine, and the elder who rents the room beneath will swear that gout leaves him for a week. If he pays on time, you will forget the fight you had last Sunday. Your notes are cramped and smudged with oil. You scribble the proportions: 2 fingers of wine, a thumb of spirit, a handful of rue, and under that a crossing out in the words. If plague, add theriac. Theriac is a kitchen sink remedy, an overstuffed potion of long reputation, viper's flesh in some recipes, mixed with many spices and a base of honey. It does not cure everything, but it gives people hope and oftentimes enough. Courage to stay alive while their bodies do the rest. A woman's voice rises in the lane, thin and sharp like flint. Someone has tied a chalk X on a neighbor's door. Plague rumors spread as fast as gossip, and the town's watchman is asking questions. You feel the familiar tug of business. Fear fills coin purses. A mother lurches in, her sleeves smeared with milk and fever, carrying a feverish child who coughs in little ragged bursts. You set aside the rosemary and gentian and boil willow with meadowsweet and a pinch of poppy, not to drown the child in opiates, but to settle him. You bind warm poultices of mashed plantain to his chest and steam eucalyptus that you've never actually seen but were told of by a traveling barber surgeon. The mother cries, not from pain but from the release of handing over responsibility. You hand her a small phial and a paper-wrapped ointment and tell her to come every 3rd day. A rat scurries out of a sack and makes a greedy grab at a sprig of basil left drying on the sill. You curse at the rodent, but there's a grim humor in the encounter. A rat that likes basil is almost domestic. You kick the sack aside and it disappears into a gap in the wall. The side incident is trivial but true. Your larder will never be sanctified. Keep the herbs sealed, you tell yourself, or else the mice and the neighbors will be your only customers. Between pots you make electuaries, medicated syrups of honey and powdered roots. Honey is a preservative and an excuse. It glints like amber and coats your fingers sticky and sweet. You lick them because you can, and because it will keep you sharp. You taste test tinctures in the smallest measure you dare. An overdose of belladonna and the world spins, but used carefully, the night terrors of the bereaved might leave them to rest. You measure with your eye and your memory, and an old copper spoon that has seen more mixtures than you have patrons. A city courier bangs on the door to collect a pair of pills for a manor lady who believes any ailment is a sign of witchcraft, unless cured with herbs. He leaves coins that smell faintly of mint in his pouch, and the manor's expectations in your shadow. You think of the grand apothecaries in the city's square, ostentation, gilt labels, men in clean sleeves, and you smile. You are cheaper, more accessible, and perhaps more honest about failure. People return anyway. Desperation is a better recruiter than reputation. As twilight comes, embers in the hearth glow like the eyes of small beasts. You strain decoctions through a rag, compressing the last of the oils. The room fills with the layered scents of basil, honey, wine, and anise. Fatigue makes your fingers clumsy. You nick your thumb on the mortar's rim, and the sting wakes you better than coffee. You bandage it with comfrey and a leaf of plantain, ancient remedies for healing, and a small, private superstition that hurts less if cared for by rituals. You label the phials abbreviated Latin, a smear of soot across the glass as signature, and tuck them into a chest. The list of what you promise outnumbers what you can prove. Insomnia, insect bites, melancholy, ague, lover's pox. There is a draft or a poultice for each, all promised with the same half-truths that keep you in business. At night you close the shutters and put the lid on the alembic. The room breathes out. Outside, the city offers its own remedies. Prayers, fasts, charms. Inside, you have bottles in your hands and the stubborn belief that one more recipe, one more improvisation, might do what all the others could not. You leave a lamp burning and a little note for tomorrow's apprentice. Grind the willow finer. Watch the temperature. Do not, under any circumstances, put alum into the saffron jar. Whatever else the townsfolk demand, they will keep coming back for the smell of the shop, the warmth of your stove, and the solace of believing that sometimes a handful of garden herbs and a careful mind can bend a person's luck. You lift the lid off a wooden box and a cloud of sweet, brittle dust puffs into your face. Gum arabic, scraped and dried into pale tears, smells faintly of old honey and hay. You rub a fragment between thumb and forefinger until it flakes, then toss it into a small kettle of warm rainwater. It plops and dissolves reluctantly, leaving the water syrupy and clear. This will bind whatever color you coax from rock or root, so you watch it as if it were a small, patient animal. The monk arrives before you have your first pot strained. He stands in the doorway, hood low, hands clamped around a roll of vellum bound with twine and wax. The wax has been pressed with a ring, a sigil you don't recognize, and his eyes dart like a man who measures every word before he spends it. He mutters the name of the abbey and says quietly that these are confidential. Your job is not to judge piety. It is to make inks that will not betray secrets by flaking away or eating the page in a decade. Secrets are expensive, permanence even more so. You begin with what most scribes trust first, iron gall. You pick through a jar of oak galls, the knobbly, darkened growths that smell faintly waxy. You crush a handful in your mortar, the pestle ringing against stone like a small, dull bell. The dust is astringent against your tongue. You boil the ground galls in a fresh kettle with rainwater and a slug of vinegar to coax out the tannins. As the liquid simmers, it smells of cider gone sour. You strain it through linen into another vessel, and it pours a tawny tea that looks unpromising. Then you stir in a pinch of iron sulfate green vitriol you keep in a labeled phial. The reaction is immediate. The tea darkens to a deep, brassy brown, Then, as it sits and oxidizes, it settles to a rich, uncompromising black. The color is not instantaneous. It needs time, and you pat the rim of the kettle while you wait, feeling the impatience of a man who has mixed too many things that must be left alone. A coughing fit startles you. Your apprentice has been hovering, a lad with pigment-dusted fingernails and a perpetually singed fringe. He's tried to make lampblack in secret, setting an iron pot to smoke with oil so he could collect soot for his own experiments. The lamp black is glorious, velvety, and pure. But his furnace filled the workshop with sooty fumes, and your neighbor in the alley banged on the shutters with a broom and shouted that you were setting the whole street to smoldering. You tell the boy to sweep the soot into a jar and to keep his experiments beneath your nose. He apologizes with a face that smells of charcoal and mischief. For reds, you consider the old standbys. Cinnabar glows like fresh meat, a pigment that seems to hold fire within it. You don't warm cinnabar. Mercury's whisper is in the room, and you know what heating it can mean. Instead, you grind vermilion with a light, steady hand on a slab, feeling the bright powder dust the air and leaving a metallic tang on the back of your throat. You mix a touch of egg yolk or glare. The albumin you whip until thin to bind it for tiny illuminations. The monk's hand tightens around his vellum when you show him a smear. Yes, that's the red of saints, the blood made into ink. He nods, but there's a furtiveness there. He wants the reds vivid but not telling when the page ages. Do not use verdigris unless they understand the price, you tell him without looking away. Verdigris, the green scraped from copper where vinegar has eaten it, shines with an almost obscene freshness, the green of new leaves in spring. It stains fingers as stubbornly as a confession, and will eat at parchment if left pure. You demonstrate by placing a tiny dusting of scraped verdigris on a sample of vellum beside a smudge of iron gall. Under your lamp, the verdigris is jewel bright. After a week, under a bell jar, it will begin to attack the skin of the page. The monk draws back as if the green itself could corrupt the words. You prepare a safer green, a mix of azurite ground very fine and bound with gum and a little glare. It takes longer to prepare properly. You grind the azurite in a hollow of the mortar until it feels like talc and the blue dust settles like cold frost on your hands. It tosses a dry, mineral fug in the air that makes you want to clear your throat. You add a whisper of lime water to settle the particles, and then fold in enough gum to turn the paste into something that will flow from a quill without bleeding. There's a small calamity while you work. One of your glass alembics, a bottle you use for distilled waters, cracks with a fissure as thin as a hair. It sighs and then gives, and a trickle of distilled vinegar slaps onto the table and hisses where it meets an iron screw. You curse, swat at it with a rag, and then laugh a dry sound, because even when your tools betray you, the stains are the ones that last. You put the bottle aside to be fixed later and mark the expense down in your head. The monk watches, eyes small and bright with something like amusement. Monks know their own fragility. They understand the value of things that must be saved. You test each ink on a scrap of vellum. The iron gall flows, a thin ribbon of brown that darkens as it breathes. The lampblack lies like a line of midnight paint, and the vermilion sits like a drop of wine. You dry them by sprinkling with fine sand, pounce, then brush it off with the corner of a sleeve. The monk runs a fingertip along the lines, not pressing, just feeling for any hint of flaking or smudge. He's protective of these margins. Hidden in them are notes that would ruin families if read in the wrong order. A rat scuttles across a beam outside and dislodges a chip of plaster that falls like a tiny confession onto your heap of reds. The noise makes the apprentice jump and spill a thimble of azurite into a tray of ground matter. For a second, you think of the countless hours that will be lost extracting one from the other. Then you shrug. There are worse things than recoloring a batch. The monk smiles a little, the first sign of levity he has allowed, and says something about providence and patient hands. You tell him that providence does not pay for pigments. When everything is mixed and strained, you place the inks in small, lidded pots. You label them with a coded symbol the monk approves of, a tiny cross for the iron gall, a crescent for the lampblack, a dot within a ring for the blue. He watches you, calculating and careful, like a man who will be judged by the endurance of his texts after the next winter. He produces a small seal and presses it into the wax that binds his vellum. You wrap the pots in cloth, remind him to store them away from smoke, and point out the corner of the roof where the rain runs worst. Keep them dry, you say. Heat will sully them. Humidity will hatch mold that eats ink as if it were bread. He smiles, grateful and anxious the same time. He pays you in silver and in a promise, a prayer muttered under his breath that carries no coin but something heavier. As he goes, you watch his hood fade into the street's light, and you think of the pages he'll write with these inks. The marginalia that will hide names, the charts that map monastic lands, the secret lists of people forgotten by law but not by memory. You close the door, wipe a streak of green from your sleeve, and listen to the city continue its small, human business around your window. The work is clean for a moment. The smells stay iron on cloth, the faint honey of gum arabic, the bitter tang of vitriol, and you breathe them in like a man who knows his trade and its dangers. You yank the furnace door open, and a wall of heat slaps your face, not the distant, polite warmth of a hearth, but a living, clinging heat that makes the hairs on your forearms prickle. The crucible inside is a swollen, blistering lump of clay, veins of vitrified flux running across its skin like a river in summer. The metal within is a dark, bullseye glow, molten and patient. You hook the crucible with the long iron tongs, muscles humming, and lift. The weight is a hot promise. Sparks sprinkle off the charcoal like tiny, disgruntled stars. When you tip the crucible toward the mold, the metal pours like mercury given voice. It sings a soft, urgent hiss, and the room fills with a metallic breath, sweet, astringent, and somehow like pennies in cold rain. Drops jump from the stream and clatter against the rim of the mold, popping into blue steam where they meet water or cool air. Your palm sweats inside the glove. Beneath the glove, your skin remembers the last time a splash found flesh, and the smell of burning hair still makes you flinch. You skim the surface with a bent iron spoon, the dross, silver gray and foamy. It peels away, reluctant, and slides into a waiting dish. Sometimes the dross is useless slag. Sometimes it cradles a tiny, pregnant bead of pure metal, a button hidden like a fossil. You toss the skimmed scum into a thrice-battered crucible reserved for waste. It will be examined, hammered, and sometimes reworked into something profitable. The work is tidy only in a rough, medieval way. Sweat makes a line down your spine. You breathe shallowly to avoid the worst of the fumes, but the metallic tang lives on your tongue as if you've been chewing on coins. When the mold is empty, you set the crucible down on a bed of sand, and the metal within sings again as it cools, skinning over into a dull, heavy silence. Now comes the tedious, almost meditative part, scraping. The crucible's inner face is a map of yesterday's failures, glassy, iridescent patches that crackle under the tip of a scraper, layers of burnt flux, and stubborn, tar-like residues that flake in uneven, oil-slick ribbons. You scrape with a short, sharp iron scraper, the sound a metallic rasp like a boat being keel-scraped. Each pass sends microshards onto the bench. Some are a bright, peacocky sheen, others are dull, leaden cinder. The residues tell stories. One patch flakes off like thin glass and smells faintly of sulfur, probably from arsenic-bearing minerals you roasted 2 weeks ago. A pocket of orange powder crumbles away and clouds the air with a bitter, acrid dust. You wave your hand through the plume and feel your eyes smart, the back of your throat prickling. You curse softly and reach for a clean rag, but you know it's not enough. You turn your face away and cough. Your apprentice at the door coughs too, then chuckles in a forced way to make light of it. Laughter is a primitive varnish against the knowledge that each inhalation is a small theft from your lungs. Short incident. The apprentice, trying to be helpful, leans in to hold the lamp, and his sleeve catches a spark. For a breathless second, the cloth blazes and your head snaps over. You slap it out with the back of your hand and scold him with a string of choice words that would do in Latin and the vernacular. He stands there, singed hair puffed out like a burnt match, blinking contrition. You send him out for water and a box of sand to smother the hearth in case the wind shifts. He stumbles down the street, already muttering excuses, and you return to the scraper because the crucible won't wait for moral lessons. Short incident. A scraggly street hawker pokes his head through the open doorway, all teeth and claims, holding a small leather purse. "Cinnabar," he says, voice like gravel, pure as you'll find, redder than a cardinal's sleeve. You nearly laugh. Cinnabar is as good at making mercury as it is at making trouble. If misused, it will varnish your skull with a thin, humming poison. You tell him to leave his sample on the step and disappear. He scoffs and leaves, but later, when you boil a sliver of the stuff to drive off the mercury, the fumes curl in a treacherous way, and the apprentice turns a faint green and has to lie down. You set a wet rag on his forehead and keep scraping, because work is the only remedy you trust. The scrapings have a surprising variety. Flaky lead oxide that shines like dull pearls, glassy slag that catches the light and throws it back like peacock feathers, and a crust like old honey that refuses to yield. Some of the slag is valuable, glassy copper flux flecked with a green that hints of malachite or turquoise, and you pry it off with the point of a knife, saving it for the day you'll try to smelt it again. Other bits you throw into a waste crucible to be crushed and sieved, the goods separated from the dross by tedious hand sorting. You collect a few bright flakes and lay them on parchment. Sometimes the scrapings hold the ghost of a nugget, a little bead of metal that can be fused and hammered into coin. You smile at that possibility and then frown at the weight of the rest of the mess. You use a pestle to grind the more stubborn bits, scouring them with pumice and water until the inner wall of the crucible shows a stubborn whiteness. Then you temper the crucible again, sand from the riverbed pressed into the clay, a quick rinse, a careful reheating to anneal the repaired surface. Tempering is both art and superstition. The right cooling can keep a crucible whole through a dozen melts. The wrong cooling will split one like an old apple. Short incident. A neighbor's cat, an arrogant marmalade who thinks the workshop is his private granary, leaps up and bats a small bowl of scrapings across the bench. A silver shard skitters and clinks off the floor. You hiss and the cat gives you a look of offended entitlement, then swallows something with the casual disdain of a minor noble. You sigh, reclaim the shard, it's fine, a minor loss, and return to your work. The cat is not helpful, but it is company. By the time you're finished, the crucible looks like a welder's relic. Blackened exterior, inner surface pitted and smoothed, a tiny ring of glass where flux failed to stick. You sweep the bench clean with a straw broom, the residue whispering into the dustpan. The house smells of iron and smoke and the faint, strange sweetness of burnt bone and mercury. You set the scraped metal to one side, label it in a spidery hand, and lock the good away. Then you sit for a moment, hands black with soot, and let the room's heat come down around you like an old friend. You have cooled metal, you have removed residues that would poison tomorrow's patients, and you have survived another day of coaxing elements into usefulness. You close the furnace with a measured push and the workshop exhales ash and heat. Outside, someone shouts an argument about a bad goat. Inside, the metals sleep until the next call. You motion to your apprentice to sweep up and send him for fresh water. You rub the scraper across your shirt to clear the worst of the dust, listening for any new sound that would mean another spill, another spark, another small disaster waiting to be turned into profit or lesson. The work is filthy and fragile, and tomorrow the crucible will gather new histories you will be called on to scrape away. You don't have to look. Up to know he's arrived, the door shudders against the frame with the practiced shove of a man used to getting what he wants. The patron fills the threshold like a shadow, heavy cloak smelling of damp leather, boots caked with road mud, the faint perfume of citrus and ink that means he has money and scribes who flatter him. He plants both hands on the workbench and stares. The look isn't curious, it's acquisitive. "I paid for results, not parables," he snaps. His voice bounces off the cold glass and copper around you. "Where is this miracle you promised? Where is the proof?" You are knee-deep in a jar of blackened sand and the oily sheen of an amalgam that refuses to cooperate. Your fingers have the fine, dry grit of ground metals embedded beneath the nails. Your thumb aches where the pestle bit into it when your apprentice, poor, enthusiastic Tomas, tripped earlier. You lift your face slowly, tasting the air. Sulfur at the back of the throat, the faint sweetness of heated mercury, soot that stains the roof of the mouth like spent lace. Miracles are expensive and temperamental, you say. Your voice is steadier than you feel. You set the pestle down and tap a scorch mark with a corner finger, leaving a fresh crescent of ash. They are also performed in stages, not by command of a purse. He laughs with no humor. Stages? My patience isn't divided into stages. I paid you 3 months ago for the tincture and the projection you swore would change pewter into treasure. You feel the old muscle memory of explanation. The 4 elements, the phases of nigredo and albedo, the patient transmutation that men used to hide fraud behind. But tonight you need more than words. You need something he can hold and swallow and take to his count. You sweep your hand along the bench and press a small, cupped lump to the table's scarred wood. It looks almost like a coin, a dully shining, bellied bead that refuses to be dismissed at a glance. This is the first return, you tell him, letting the bead catch the light. Up close it reveals its truth, an alloy not minted. You coat your mouth with a grin that smells faintly of iron and smoke. It passes the eye and the touch. Will it buy bread? No. Will it sit in a chest and make the suspicious neighbor squint? Perhaps. He slaps the bench and a tiny vial clinks off a shelf. The sound distracts you both. The vial explodes in a harmless spritz as it hits an iron nail, scattering a thread of crimson powder across the board. Tomas yelps, and while you turn, the workshop's cat, black and indignant, leaps onto the table and noses at the bead. It bats it, sending it rolling. For a heartbeat, you fear the patron will storm out. Instead, he pockets the bead with the wary reverence of a man who wants to love what might be a lie. You'll show me what it is, he insists. No more tricks. Fine. You fetch a small iron cup, the one you use for cupellation when separating silver from lead. The heat of the forge breathes across your shins. Flames lick the crucible's lip, throwing orange light against the patron's face, throwing his beard into gold. You drop the bead into the cup and tap cold water at the edge, producing a hiss that smells of wet ash and metal. The bead darkens, then dwells. It will not transmute instantly, that is obvious. But the heat does what heat always does, it reveals. He leans in, and the reflection of the fire fans across his eyes. If it's true gold, test it, he says. If it's base metal, I take my money back. You pick up a scrap of genuine silver from a drawer, a thin, warped token with the king's stamp, passed to you by a traveling soldier who wanted to know if his pay had been clipped. With your knife you file a tiny curl from it. The smell is metallic and bright. You file a second curl from the bead. You hold both to the flame, then touch both to a small lump of aqua fortis you brewed last summer, nothing noble, but it eats silver when you let it. The silver darkens immediately, the bead holds. An alloy then, you say, not pure, but it takes gilding. You pull a leather cloth from a hook and rub the bead briskly with a solution of mercury and fine gold leaf you've prepared for the noble's signet rings. The mercury gleams, a new sheen swallowing the dullness. When you stop, the bead flashes like a promise. He reaches out before you stop him. His fingertips come away with a faint, sickly smear. It's warm, he mutters. It smells like your shop. That's the mercury, you knit your fingers together. It will come off. If you prefer a more certain proof, I can stress it with the cupel. I can show you the process and the loss, and you will judge whether the miracle is worth the cost. As if on cue, another small crisis. A crash from the rafters. One of your jars, the one containing pulverized cinnabar, topples, spilling a red dust like blood on peat. The red is bright and indecent. The cat sniffs and sneezes a gout of delicate powder that clings to its whiskers. Tomas scrambles up a ladder, muttering apologies, and you swat his sleeve with a cracked glove. Mind the air, you command. Breathe through the rag. The patron watches all this with the narrow patience of a man used to counting minutes in cash. You circle me with words and powder, he says. I want the coin. You could tell him the truth that the great work is a lifetime and often failure, that many who seek it die from their own curiosity, that you too have blackened more than your fair share of reputations and fingernails. But truth is heavy, and the patron's purse is light. Instead, you produce a different demonstration, the art of repair and recovery. You show him how you extract gold flakes trapped in old coinage using mercury, showing the mercury's beads swallowing the metal, and then yielding it when you heat the amalgam in the crucible and trap the vapor in a cool receiver. It is not a miracle. It is slow alchemy recycling cunning. Watch, you say. The room leans close, Tomas, the cat, even the patron's retainer who had been loitering in the doorway. The amalgam melts and hisses, and from the dull, scorched mass the gold will emerge, thin as a promise and no less valuable to a man without patience. He grunts, satisfied and not. So you can make gold from gold, he says, half insult, half by. From that which contains gold, you correct. I cannot spin straw into coin. If you want a proper projection, if you want a tincture that will truly change Lead's nature, that takes more time and materials. You let the final words hang there like a coin poised on a balance. And if you cut corners, you'll waste both. Outside, a child's laugh peals. Someone bangs a tray at the tavern across the lane. The world carries on like a great indifferent market. The patron glances toward the door, toward his retinue, toward the city and its impatient justice. He counts months in threats, not processes. He is a man who will go where his money and pride push him. Finally, he sighs, and the sound is almost a concession. A demonstration, then. I will take this recovery for now. But know this, if I am cheated, I will bring the guild, the bishop, or a knife to your throat. I will not waste another winter. You bow your head, not in fear, but in the weary truce of someone who has argued this out a dozen times. Then watch me work, you say. Watch me separate, refine, and render what you already own into something purer. And while you watch, keep your hand away from the mercury. It bites unseen. He takes the bead, pockets the little coin you made him, and tosses a purse on the bench. The light from the forge puckers across the gold thread like an oath. You accept the coin and the threat with the same small, clean gesture. The patron's boots scrape the threshold and he is gone, the door swinging after him like a bell. Tomas cusses softly, the cat flicks its tail and sneezes a crimson mote, and you return to your bench. You set the cupel back to the flame and listen to the fire breathe. Outside, the street hums. Inside, the work resumes. You are an artisan and a conjurer, too. The credulous, you are also a man who knows how to make something of value out of what already is. Tonight, that will have to be enough. You set the quill to the rim of the pudding-brown ink and hesitate as if the thing will look back. Light from the single high window is weak and putty-colored today. It slants across the table and makes the dust in the air look like a moving map. You breathe in, iron and tannin, the sour tang of sweat, a faint metallic whiff of mercury from the bench below where last night's distillation left its whisper. The page before you is clean, a small island of vellum that will carry everything you plan to hide. Secrecy here is both tradecraft and ritual. You know the men who would pay for your recipes and the men who would pay to see your ruin. You learned early that an alchemical recipe written plainly is a map to your throat. So you invent and layer codes like a mason laying brick, not to bewilder the curious, but to make any honest reader work 3 times as hard as a thief is willing to. It comforts you, it is also indispensable. You begin with symbols, not the flowery sun and moon scribbles tourists expect, but a tight, practical shorthand. A triangle with a dot becomes calcine, an S with a crossbar becomes sublime, and a little dot over a line is slow fire. These are not mystical flourishes. They are instructions you can read in the half-light and the apprentice cannot. To anyone else they are doodles. Your crabbed hand moves quickly now, the quill clicking as it lays down a ladder of strokes. The ink is iron gall, dark, permanent, a little corrosive on the tongue if you should foolishly taste it, mixed with lampblack so your letters bite the page and refuse to fade. Next comes language. Latin is the cloak you throw over ordinary speech, but Latin on its own is merely the lingua franca. You need misdirection. So you pepper your notes with fake recipes for mundane things. One margin holds what appears to be a recipe for a plaster to soothe gout. It will repel the layman who skims looking for wealth. Beneath it, in an inverted line read only in a mirror, is your true method for refining a particular mercury compound, the one you have no right to be anywhere near. You use steganography without ceremony. Milk is used as invisible ink, common enough that no one thinks twice if you write apparently empty lines, and then pass the page before a candle. The milk chars and blackens only when warmed. A novice or a thief will see only a few faded scratches, but you, who know the exact temperature to hold the flame, will watch the milk flour into letters. You also keep a vial of diluted vitriol, a single, nearly transparent stroke of it, hidden within a flourish, will eat the paper a little and leave a pale clue when rinsed in vinegar. These are not parlor tricks. Each method is chosen because it can be performed with the tools on hand, and because it will fail to reveal itself to anyone not intimately familiar with your hand. You pepper the pages with names that are not names at all. Old John, in a recipe, marks a step to roast your ore to a certain color. Sweet water means distilled rain captured in an oaken cask, not drinking water, but the solvent for your separations. You have a private lexicon that springs from tavern jokes and butcher shop shorthand. It's absurd and brilliant at once. When the parish clerk with a nose for gossip corners your manuscript, he reads the recipe for stew and nods approvingly. He leaves thinking you are simply a charming eccentric who makes good broth. A short incident. Your cat, as if offended by the secrecy, leaps onto the table and bats a vial with the heel of its paw. You lurch, but the glass only skitters and thuds. A sprinkle of green powder, lucky for you, lands on the floor instead of your notes. The cat stares at the spill and then, as if punishing you for lacking amusement, kneads the parchment with one muddy paw. You clap the cat away and press a boot to the corner of the page, smoothing the smear before it becomes misreadable. There is humor in the mess. You smile despite yourself. The cat, unrepentant, curls on the scrap heap. A messenger pops his head into the doorway, breathless with a different sort of crisis. A neighbor's child has swallowed a bead of mercury, and the village thinks it a miracle. They want you to make sense of it. You wave him off with a grunt and an instruction to fetch vinegar and a whetstone. It isn't your concern, and yet it intrudes, as such things always do, into your fishbowl of concentration. You write in the margin a tiny cross to mark where that interruption began, so later you'll know which steps were written before you were flustered. You employ deliberate obscurantism in the physical layout, too. Lines end with odd breaks. A process that is logically connected is split across several pages. You use different hands, sometimes your careful italic, sometimes a wild, shaking script you adopt on purpose, to mislead those who might try to compare handwriting. When you sign a key passage, you sign with a dot and a flourish that resembles a merchant's mark. You wrap entire sections in a chain of seemingly unrelated marginalia, a list of herbs, a child's counting rhyme, a copy of a psalm. Each is innocuous. Together they are a lock. You keep a cipher wheel tucked between the leaves, a crude instrument made from cardboard and thread, but effective. Rotate it, and what looks like salt of. The wise becomes mercurial salt to you and nonsense to everyone else. The wheel is labeled in the cramped hand of someone who has learned to write numbers that mean more than themselves. Sometimes you encode not only ingredients but temperatures. The symbols for soft fire and hard fire are different, and you combine them with the wax seals you press into the corners to indicate repetition counts. Another small drama shifts the air. Outside there is a shouted argument, then the thunk of boots on wood. Someone, perhaps a rival or perhaps a drunken jester, hammers questions against your door. You do not open it. Instead, you fold your most dangerous page twice, run a bead of wax over the fold, and stamp it with your private ring. The wax crackles, brittle as old promises, and you tuck the paper into a chest beneath the bench. You let the shouting dwindle. The chest smells of cedar and old smoke. It will protect more than the wax ever could. When you are done, the page is both a map and a Mongol siege. Dense, cruel to read, but perfectly legible to your eye. You close the book and press the palm of your hand across the cover, as if to seal not only the ink but the memory. There is an art to leaving behind scraps that invite curiosity, yet yield nothing. You practice it like prayer. You step back and consider the pile of coated leaves. Each one is a little trap for the ignorant and a larder for the cunning. You blow out the candle, and in the smoky dark, you can still picture every symbol. They burn not outward but inward. You are solving a puzzle you insist must remain unsolved by others. It keeps you alive. It keeps you rich enough to buy more dangerous powders. And when the night presses hard against the windows and the mud outside smells of wet horses and bad decisions, you smile at the absurdity of your safety. A system of jokes and tricks that would make any judge laugh, and any thief curse in equal measure. You freeze mid-breath, lungs full of something like scorched citrus and metal. The last sound, a high, brittle crack that might have been the voice of the universe, or only the neck of glass surrendering, still rings in the rafters. Light from the brazier throws long shadows on the splinters scattered across the workbench and floor. Tiny stars lie where, a heartbeat ago, a bulbous retort held a rainbow of liquids you swore would yield gold or at least a pleasing blue. Now the rainbow is a hazard. Heat fans from the scorched wood. The alembic's long swan neck is sheared, jagged as a saw. Droplets of the mixture have burst into beads that sing like quicksilver in the pan before collapsing to a dull black patch on the hearthstone. Acrid steam curls up and your throat objects. You splash. Vinegar behind your teeth, because that's what the old manuscript suggests when your tongue tastes iron. Your fingertips throb where a sliver has nicked the pad of one thumb. You press a rag to it. The fabric is already stained with a map of unknown colors. Shards bite the floorboards. Some are tiny, like glitter. Others are long crescents that have cut the lip of your pewter cup. You find yourself on your knees without thinking, gathering the larger pieces with the sleeve of your tunic, because you never trust anyone else with glass that used to hold your hopes. The sleeve gives and the sharp edge draws a line along your skin. You curse softly, the kind of curse that sounds more like a diagnosis than an insult, and spit a little blood onto the sand on the hearth to stop it from running. A small, practical ritual, bandage, then get on with the work. You sweep. The broom is an old thing, straw bound to a stick with twine from the binding shop. It makes a dry, satisfying sound as it drives fragments toward a heap. The finer dust clings to the fibers of the broom and to the wet rag you use to clear the bench. You rub until the work surface smells less of burned resin and more like scrubbed wood. When the bench gleams halfway, you see what the explosion flung loose. A smear of something like rust but redder cinnabar. And a scatter of very fine, glittering powder that you treat like rumor, dangerous and hard to pin down. A rat slips from under a barrel, drawn, you suspect, by the recent commotion. It noses the heap of glittering dust as if to carry off a treasure and nearly steps on a shard. You startle it with a flick of your wrist. The animal scurries, tail high, vanishes into a crack in the wall, and leaves a smear of paw prints across a spilled puddle of dark liquid. You laugh, not because it's funny, but to throw the tension off your chest, and make a note to plug the crack tomorrow. If nothing else, you don't need vermin to smear your reagents into other experiments. You work with method, the slow, stubborn procedure averted by habit. Pick up the big shards with tongs. Deposit them, clinking, into an iron pot set aside for salvage. The pot is dented and keeps the room's noises low when it receives glass. Then you turn to the smaller pieces. A strip of stale bread, a piece you saved for just such an indignity, becomes your broom for glitter. The bread presses and lifts, swallowing the worst of the shards and the tiniest slivers that will otherwise find your bare skin, your bedding, or someone else's hand. It feels absurd and medieval, and precisely the thing an apprentice will sneer at when he swears you've been soft since the outbreak of ulcers. In the South, you are grateful for the absurdity because it works. There is a smell that won't be swept away, something like rotten eggs mingled with struck flint. It comes from the remains of the flask's contents. You know the names and consequences of the materials you play with. Vitriol puffs a sulfurous breath when it's angered. Aqua fortis throws vapor that will peel paint from a door. You breathe slower and through the hem of your apron, tucking the fabric under your nose like a makeshift mask. The air tastes of copper and old letters. A knock at the door is 2 knocks too forceful to be accidental. You look up to see the city watchman half in and half out of the doorway, his face the color of damp leather. He peers at the floor, at the glass, and at you. "Heard a blast," he says, as if you don't know. You answer that it was only a flask and that no house is burned, which is more than can be said for your patience. He grunts and wanders off, muttering about practitioners of vanity. You pass it off with a shrug that would be grand if not for the stinging in your forearm. An apprentice arrives just then, panting and apologetic. He has been sent by a noble to ask about progress on an elixir, a request you will not encourage until you are certain the roof will remain attached to the house. He holds a jar of vermilion in both hands and with the clumsiness of youth nudges the bench where you work. The jar leans. You catch it with an elbow but not before a smear of red dust, bright as blood in sunlight, fans onto the floor. He swears humorlessly. You tell him to fetch a wet cloth and to mind the attic stairs since you'll be busy reprimanding him later. The apology is quick and earnest and therefore makes you angrier, which is a useful thing. It keeps you from pity. As you sweep, you discover a pattern in the debris, flecks of glass that form a line, as if the retort had been trying to point the way to the door on its final breath. You pick them up and, for reasons you do not want to analyze, put them into a small leather pouch you use for slivers of unexpected luck. The pouch already holds a petition written by a widow, a scrap of vellum with a diagram you couldn't decipher, and a coin that looks old enough to be worth someone's silence. Small collections like these are what keep a workshop from being merely a room for fires and fumes. They make it a place with history, even when the latest experiment insists on screaming. Once the visible glass is gone, you take a candle and hold it close to the floor to catch what your sweep doesn't. The flame trembles across the splinters and throws microscopic shadows. In the seam between two boards, something metallic glints. You pry it free with the tip of your knife. It is a sliver of metal, perhaps off a brazier, perhaps part of the alembic's arm. It will be useful. You set it aside with the pot of big shards. You wash your hands in a basin of warm water that smells faintly of camphor and rosemary. The water runs red at the edges where the small nick on your thumb is. The sting is nothing compared to the memory of what might have happened. A flare that breathes down the rafters, a patron's cloak alight, a monastery letter charred beyond proof. You have lost nice glassware before. You have cursed, bought more alembics, and taught yourself not to expect miracles from anything that can be melted by a hearth. Outside the door, the market sounds continue. A bell, a hawker, laughter that is too loud for the severity of the day. You take a breath and decide the day is not yet done. You will file the jagged lip of the retort, add a patch of clay to the cracked funnel, and make a stronger brace for the neck of your next vessel. You will also set a small sign in the window, not an advertisement, but a plain notice that the day is not for novices who can't hold a jar steady. The sign, you know from experience, will do more to keep the city watch away than any explanation at the door. You toss the leather pouch into the back of your desk and pour the glass in the iron pot into the forge heap for later. Your hands are grimy and smell like the business you practice. You fold the bandage over your thumb, press the cloth tight, and listen once more to the house settle. Somewhere above, a beam gives. You glance up, and in a voice polished by habit more than hope, you tell the room, "Not today, then." The room replies with the creak of a joist and the distant clack of a cart in the street, as if agreeing. You are not out of danger. You are merely out of glass for the moment, and that is enough. You work the wax by touch before you trust your eyes. A shaving of beeswax sits in a copper ladle over the brazier, paling and softening, and you feel the heat through the wooden handle. The smell that rises is rich, sweet, and resinous, a small mercy amongst the other stenches of the room. Your fingers are already knotted with dust, a dark vermilion that refuses to scrub off, a pale chalk that flakes like dried skin. You pull the ladle closer, let a bead of wax fall through a fine spout and land on the rim of a glass phial. It hisses softly, sloughing into a molten petal that runs and cools around the neck, sealing the thing inside like a mouth-stitched purse. Outside, the street traffic carries the city's usual chorus: cartwheels on packed dirt, a butcher's shout, a dog's bark. Inside, the pause is pronounced. You can hear the wax settle, the tiny imperceptible creak as it hardens. The seal has a job beyond concealment. It keeps the powder away from damp air that will cake it. It keeps curious noses away from the first, sharp exhale of something that will burn a throat. And more importantly, it keeps curious hands from seeing the contents until you have decided whom to disappoint. You form the seals the old way: drip, cap, impress. There's a small iron signet on the bench, not yours, but a hand-me-down from a wealthy patron who liked to think you were under his protection. You heat it in the brazier until it glows orange and stamp the wax with a blunt press. The mark makes the thing look official. People respect a burned impression. You make a second impression with a loop of twine, so it seems to have been bound for transport. It is theater as much as it is craft. A gust from the door flings in a child's shadow before the boy himself slips his head round the frame. He has come to deliver a message, though he lingers to stare. You see his eyes wander to the row of jars. He is at the age where curiosity is indistinguishable from hunger. He reaches out with a filthy finger. Your hand moves like a cat's. You flick a sealed lump toward the table and make a soft joke about how the wax is hot to the touch. The boy yelps, still keeps the warning between his teeth, and scurries off with the message. Side incident 1. You stamp your seal into the back of his hand with just enough heat to make him forget to peek, and he learns to deliver letters without lingering. You do not trust the glass entirely. Small phials will crack from a blow, and glass does nothing for prying eyes who know how to twist corks. For your most volatile powders, the golden yellow grains that taste like death or the silvery dust that crawls with Mercury's mood, you wrap them in paper, fold them into little bundles, and then enrobe those bundles in wax like mummifying a dangerous thing. Waxing is a performance: twist, tuck, drip. When cooled, the bundle feels like a pebble, unremarkable. You roll a thin skin of beeswax around a flat wooden poker, and with a knife shape it to look like a scrap of candle wax. On the outside, you smear ash so it seems genuine. People will pick up a pebble of wax and think only of their own dull household candles. Another visitor interrupts. A stout woman from number 2, complaining that smoke has stained her washing. She believes alchemists are responsible for everything people whisper about, just as good a scapegoat as anyone. You slide a simple jar into the alcove by your bench and seal it with a thick disc of blackened wax. Toss it toward the hearth so it looks like you're tending to it, then step from behind your screen to swear at the brazier on her behalf. Side incident 2. She plants her knuckles on the sill and, convinced you are merely a tinkerer of candles, leaves you her used drippings for proper melting. You pocket them in case you ever need a decoy. A rat decides the day to attempt an archaeological dig under the bench. It is small, bold, and smelling of last night's vermin stew. Its claws rattle a tray of unlabeled metal salts. A glass ampule wobbles, tips, and drops. You catch it with the crook of your elbow. Your heart thuds as if you had dropped it yourself. The tiny sound of sand-like powder kissing the floor is louder than you expect. You snatch up a wad of cloth, sweep the dust into a hollowed tin, and cap it immediately with a pour of wax. Side incident 3. The rat becomes an unwilling apprentice, following the scrap of wax and thinking it some new kind of breadcrumb. You shrug and bide your time. The presence of other living things always makes human visitors more nervous. Sealing powders in wax is a craft of misdirection as much as of preservation. You make decoys, common flour dust, powdered bone meant to look like the more prized calcined metals, and leave them in plain sight. A noble might scent the air and ask for some of that wondrous white dust. He is shown a jar that looks the part, and the jar is anointed with wax and stamped with the insignia of a non-existent merchant. He leaves pleased, pockets a small sample, and thinks himself closer to secret knowledge. The real things you wedge behind boards, under the floor, or inside the hollow of a cane, all coated thickly with beeswax, sometimes dipped in resin mixed with lampblack, so that the outside looks sinister and forbidding instead of inviting. Heat is your enemy and your ally. Too much and a volatile salt will bloom into a plume of choking smoke. Too little and the wax will crack, letting the damp creep in and bind the crystals. You test each seal. You wrap it with a fingernail, listen for the dull thunk of solid wax. You press, smell, and if necessary, add a ring of pitch at the edge for good measure. You mark the underside of the wax with a pinprick to release any trapped air before it becomes a curse. When you have to move the sealed things, you wrap them in oiled cloth. The oil keeps humidity from seeping into the wax and keeps thieves from recognizing the lumps for anything more than useless candle detritus. People suspect everything you do is magical. They tell stories, that you can transmute poor copper into coin, that you can make a man young. Again by anointing him with mercury. You nod and make a show of combing an invisible beard. The truth is uglier and more mortal. You are a steward of dangerous knowledge who must often play a liar to stay alive. Wax is a small, practical lie. It buys you time, it fools the quick-handed, and it keeps the worst of the vapors contained while you decide whether a substance is to be used, sold, or buried in the yard at night. When you finally blow out the brazier, your fingers are streaked with resin and powder. The seals glint in the dying light like black moons. You tuck the pressed signet back into its velvet and snap the lid on a crate of coated bundles. Outside, the city settles into its chorus of lamps and footsteps. Inside, the remains of a day's craft breathe quietly beneath wax, patient and mute. You mouth a short, grateful oath to bees, to the little iron signet, to the luck that keeps your customers foolish and your hands alive. And then you lock the door and shove the key into a pocket lined with wax, so if anyone ever fishes about there, they'll only find something sticky and useless. You sling the bellows shut for the night and the workshop exhales. The charcoal coals gutter down to a softer hiss. For a moment, the room is nothing but the slow tick of a cooling crucible and the faint, stubborn smoke that refuses to leave the rafters. You sit on the low stool you've carved your initials into and let your hands rest in your lap, fingers still aching from a morning spent wresting metal into submission. The pungent perfume of the day, the sour vinegar, the iron tang of scorched copper, and that indefinable, lingering thing you spilled on the floor, hangs around you like an old, guilty friend. It's been another full day in 1462. Recap the day to yourself, the way you always do when the lamps are low, and the street outside has softened into a quilt of distant footsteps and the occasional dog chorus. You remember waking under the shelf-stacked avalanche of ingredients, the cold of the stone floor pressing through your robe. You remember the noble barging in mid-afternoon, his fingers stained with opulence and impatience, demanding gold as if the transmutation were a street vendor delivering bread. You remember the monk who came bearing parchment and hope for invisible ink, speaking in that earnest hush reserved for people who trust handwritten secrets more than they trust their own hands. You remember the apprentice who set a tray of powders too close to the embers, and the small, satisfying explosion that sent a cloud of glittering dust across the room, and a string of colorful curses from your mouth. You replay the experiments in sharper detail. The alembic you assembled at dawn with half-remembered instructions from a manuscript that smelled of mildew and scribbled mistakes. The mercury you coaxed into a mirror-like sheen, and the way it seems to hold your expression back at you, warped and contemplative. The hours grinding metals into a powder the color of old pennies, teeth gritting against the interminable sameness of the motion. The crucible heated until it sang, the first blistered bubbles forming on the surface of a concoction you had promised, if only to yourself, would be the key to the great work. You worked with confidence and with superstition. You worked because there was nothing else to do. Curiosity is cheaper than rent. And then there was the failure, because there always is the failure. The bubbling mixture blackened where it should have transmuted. The noble's promise of coin dissolved into the same smoke that curls from your still-wet cloth. The monk left with a recipe for invisible ink, trusting you to keep the secret. You tucked the parchment beneath an old ledger and wondered if your hands, already stained with so much, could be trusted with more secrecy. You burned your palm on a hot crucible and spat out the expletives of someone who would rather be feared than pitied for ineptitude. You patched a cracked ampule with wax and a sarcastic prayer to whatever saints attend to fools and alchemists, and you slept in the corner again, shoulders hunched under the weight of the day. Tonight, in the quiet that follows, myth and reality sit across from each other at your little wooden table and stare. The myth is a great, glowing thing. Philosopher's stones that turn lead to gold, elixirs that pull the teeth of time from a body. An immortal promise wrapped around a single, miraculous secret. It glows. It sells manuscripts and sparks pilgrimages. People bring you gemstones and desperate prayers because myth is easier to explain than the slow, grinding truth. The reality is quieter, grittier, and far less satisfying on the street corners. The real work is about heating and cooling, dissolving and distilling learned repetition, an apprenticeship of bruises and burned fingers. It is heavy on mercury and arsenic, and light on miracles. It is the trade of making things purer and changing alloys, and occasionally discovering a more useful method to solder a plate. It is proto-chemistry masquerading as esoteric spirituality. Your manuscripts are full of cages of metaphor, stages of the great work disguised as birds and lions, because language carries more safety when wrapped in symbols. The truth is you learn methods that will make later generations call you a craftsman who flirted with philosophy. The truth is the puddle of mercury on your bench will rot your nerves in a way the metaphors never promised. The truth is you will cough more days than you will transmute. The contrast keeps you grounded. Myth pulls coin and reverence. It gives you status and a very convenient excuse when nothing works and the noble's purse stays shut. Reality gives you calluses and lists of tangible improvements. A better flux, a purer salt, a forged iron that will not split a plow. Tonight, you feel both the bitter tang of unfulfilled promises and the small, stubborn satisfaction of a method that, however imperfect, is slowly carving sense out of chaos. You find yourself grateful in surprising ways. Grateful for the apprentice's clumsy loyalty, for the monk's steady coin when he traded parchment instead of purse, for the noble's impatience that forces you to try something new. Mostly, you find gratitude for the things you do not have. Clean rooms with bell jars that fit snugly into their places, polished brass instruments, a vented hood that actually removes the aroma of burnt experiments from your lungs. You imagine, for a moment, the hands of some future chemist with gloves and goggles, strange, protective glass bolted to a modernized alembic, and you laugh, a small, rueful sound. In your mind's eye, that future person is both your critic and your heir. They wear less risk and carry more certainty. You envy them their hospital's steady light. You pity them their lack of poetry. There is a strange comfort in the old ways, though. The music of it, a tray clattering, a student's laugh, the shop bell at dawn. The world outside your shuttered window, a mosaic of merchants and prayers and the smell of freshly baked bread, keeps rhythm with your failures. You are part of an economy of hope and hazard. Your craft today means someone's needle will not break tomorrow. Your crude inks will make maps more legible. The monk's invisible ink might keep a secret that alters a history you cannot read yet. Your misfires and your small discoveries both ripple outward. You press a rag over the worst of the stains, pack away the dangerous powders into labeled jars you have learned to trust by feel, and put the sealed ampules inside a wooden chest. The labels are little oaths. Mercury, handle with care. Sulfur, keep dry. Saltpeter, away from sparks. You do a ritual tidy, the kind that quiets the mind as much as it organizes the bench. You close the shutters against the chill and hang the candle into a hook where its light cannot catch stray vapors. The street outside softens further. The noble's carriage has gone. The monk's shoes have long since faded from the cobbles. In the silence, even the small, steady cough that has been a companion this season seems less accusing, more companionable. You think about the great work, not as a mystical destination, but as an ache in your hands. It is something you chase because you are human, and because you like, secretly and stubbornly, to watch transformation happen under your own breath. The great work is patience, repeated action, and the willingness to get things wrong until you get them right. It is the opposite of the miracle the noble buys with a coin and a smile. Tonight, you let yourself be proud of that stubbornness. Finally, you unroll the tiny, nearly empty bottle you keep for yourself, the one that smells faintly of rosemary and vinegar, a folk remedy more for the nerves than the body, and take a sip. It tastes of home and half-remembered cures. You set the bottle down carefully, as if setting a little piece on the rough wooden table. You will do this again tomorrow. You will wake under your shelves, breathe in the familiar smell, and pick up the threads you could not finish. You will examine the scorched residue on the alembic glass and make notes in the margin of a manuscript you cannot fully decipher. You will laugh when the apprentice trips, scold when the noble is intolerant, and accept the monk's coins with a smile that is as practiced as any distillation. As you snuff out the candle and let the room settle into darkness, that stubborn ember of curiosity is the last thing you feel. It is not the philosopher's stone. It is not immortality. It does not erase the cough or the stains. It keeps you here, in this room full of dangerous knowledge and small victories, because it does not let you be content with what you already know. That ember is a promise that growth can be slow and still be real. You curl into your corner, under the shelves stacked with ingredients and uncertainties, and fall asleep to the distant sounds of a city that has already forgotten the day, but will remember in small ways, the work you weigh on its markets and ink its parchments. You are not a miracle worker. You are a craftsperson with soot in your lashes and a ledger that records more failures than triumphs. And tonight, like every night you can count on, you are tired and stubbornly grateful. Grateful for the breath that still fills your lungs, for the hands that still work, and for the dim knowledge that someday, perhaps not in your lifetime, someone will stand where you stand and owe part of their certainty to your messy, smoky lab. The ember holds, you sleep.